Closer. Hello. Hi there. Today, for the stream, I just want to quickly touch on a subject, not doing anything software related today. Just going to talk a little bit about what it means to practice as a creative or as a designer, being a multidisciplinary, this practice of multidiscipline, right? And what that means for you for the learning process and what it can mean for you in the longevity of your career. Um, Early on in my career and my studies, I was pretty jealous of some people who were specializing in certain areas, who were clearly going to have success in one really specific focused area, and that developed really quickly for them. And you could clearly see how they developed really quickly in that path that they had laid out for themselves. For myself and other people, it wasn't so clear what it was that we wanted to do, right? Or maybe we had, for some, a lot of interests are spread out into many different uh, creative outlets, right? Or having a lot of hobbies, let's say. And I want to say, just over time, how that actually benefits a lot into your development as a creative, your development as a designer, and as a professional. Uh, I had this moment as I was sketching or drawing with charcoals, because I used to do that in high school in art class. That's kind of where I got my start in art or in design, was high school or middle school, whatever it was when I moved into the US. Those art classes and using charcoal and breaking down what it was that we had in front of us and translating that into hand gestures on paper that resembled or transmitted what it is that we would see in the real physical world into a visual, right? When I studied architecture, they impose on you a different way of drawing, which is kind of like they call it, you can't do any hairy lines, which means you can't repeat the same stroke over and over to draw that same edge, right? You're supposed to draw a straight on, clean line and get that edge, right? So when I picked up drawing again, I found myself going through this design process for drawing, and it was very stressful because it wasn't perfect, or it wasn't capturing what it was that I wanted to draw. And something clicked where I remembered it was actually in reverse how it was that it was taught initially in art, right? So in architecture or in design, when you're designing products or spaces and you're doing those clean lines, you start out with light lines on pencil, then light lines with ink to do the entire drawing, and then you go with medium size ink pens or thicker ink pen to get in some more profiles or some major lines, and then you end up silhouetting out entire shapes with a thicker line. So when drawing artistically, it's in a way an opposite, where yes, you're getting out everything on the paper very, very lightly, but rather than getting out shapes and very decisive lines, you can kind of be a bit more chaotic in your movements. You're breaking down shapes that aren't necessarily there. You might be drawing negative space, or you're essentially trying to start by drawing out shadows. And so you end up going with your darker regions last as well. You keep getting darker and darker to add in more detail, but the detail comes in towards the end, right? As you're bringing out this image. So it was kind of like this switch where I was sort of able to combine both techniques into getting out a drawing, and it took a lot of the pressure off in that scenario. And if I had just learned one way, or if I had just learned the other way, I wouldn't have had that same outcome or that same sort of state of play that I was able to achieve. So ultimately, what I'm getting at is exposing yourself to different avenues for expressing or creating can really help with finding really what it is that it is to be creative. Is you have this need to get out these ideas, or these what would you call them? There's this word, I haven't been able to find the right translation to it in English. In Spanish, we call it inquietud, which is like a combination of sort of a curiosity and restlessness, right? So I think having these different avenues for exploring different creative tendencies actually leads you to make these connections that you wouldn't make otherwise. So, for example, talking about photography, photography to me is almost like it's a really good entryway into creative, or it's sort of the minimal effort for creativity. Not that photography is easy, but it does introduce a lot of fundamentals into that practice, right? Where you're talking about composition, you're talking about color, you're talking about lighting. You have to consider these different things, depth, and so forth. And you're really doing this through the tool of a camera, which captures literally what it is that you're seeing. And it has constraints that are very heavily imposed in it because it's not, I mean, later in editing you can do whatever you want, but the moment that you take a photo, you're just limited to what's in front of you and how you position yourself towards a subject, right? And so you have to force yourself to find creativity in that little bit of freedom that you do have. Then there's drawing. So as I explained, there's different styles to drawing, but depending on the approach that you have, ultimately you're looking at something or experiencing something and you're trying to transmit that into a visual, but also in something that transmits an emotion that you're experiencing for that subject that you're drawing out. So whether you do black and white, or you do pencil, or you do ink, or you do watercolors, even oils and pastels and acrylics, all those can vary greatly in the process in which you apply the paint, which determines ultimately the feeling or the ultimate result that you're going to get. But that part of the process is also forcing your brain to experience things differently as you're producing or as you're creating, right? So, for example, in watercolor versus oils, oils aren't really going to dry as you're working on the piece, right? It's like they stay malleable. However, with watercolors, you sort of need to wait for the paint to dry in order for you to keep working. So even that little nuanced difference brings that moment of pause in one, and that moment and that the flexibility that the other one offers. It in the practice of it, it really lends to a different process in the brain as you're learning of these things, or as you're reflecting on what it is that you're acting on or what you're creating from. Then we can talk about something like product design, right? Where we're talking about objects that relate to a human need or to the human body in certain ways, but that need to serve a function. Then fashion, right? Which relate to the body in a much more intimate way, in a different way, but arguably in a more intimate way, and doesn't necessarily have to follow a function, right? It could just be for the design or for the art. Then, speaking of architecture, I'm very appreciative and grateful of the background that I got in architecture, precisely because you had to think at different scales. So you could think about something like a product in terms of an object you interact with, like a doorknob or a furniture piece, right? Why would you lay down on a piece versus sit on it versus lean against it, right? And it all has to do with the form of it and the way that it calls out to you in a space. Then we're talking about space, right? How churches or religious buildings would have really tall spaces or tall ceilings to give you this sense of um, grandeur of the space, right? Always pointing up to the sky, and amazing lighting to sort of make you feel humbled or insignificant in a way. Whereas, corporate offices, when they took off in the 80s, had all those drop ceilings with fluorescent lighting, sort of turning you into a working machine, right? Compressing you, making you tense, making you fast acting or very reactive. I love this idea from Corbusier. We all have to learn about him in architecture school. And many of the traditionalists or the architecture romantics will point to a lot of his early work, right, as he's developing these rules for architecture for which he operates in. What I really appreciate is the whole entire body of work that he presents, because you could clearly see that as he got older, he started to break his own rules. And it really speaks to this idea of, first you need to master the fundamentals and master the practice of these creative practices before you can fully find your style in a way and start breaking these rules. So just wanted to take a moment and talk about the joys of being multidisciplined. The fact that if today I'm too tired or too out of focus or burnt out a bit to do some 3D work. Writing has been a creative outlet for me for a long time. So I sit down here and I start writing or I start reading something I wrote and I start polishing it. And I realize, this is actually a really interesting topic to me and I'm going to go ahead and speak about it and get out my sort of creative tendency or creative urge, my inquietud, my restlessness, get that out through that avenue. The next time I revisit a different type of work that I'll do, the 3D art or drawing in charcoals or whatever it is, I'm going to take this practice of writing and speaking into that. So that's simply the thing I wanted to express today is the joys of being multidisciplined. If you feel like there's a lot of hobbies that you have and sometimes it may feel distracting, well, ask yourself, what things are those, what things can you extract? What ideas, what value can you extract from the many different creative outlets that you have that can apply to other areas in your life? Because that's really the way where you start becoming an artist or becoming a creative, is when you find this overlap that can help you communicate better. And ultimately, what we're all trying to do is tell a story, tell a meaningful story, make our story richer, right? So thanks for watching. Hope you found some value in this. Definitely a topic I'll probably not definitely a topic definitely probably a topic I will definitely revisit in the future, but wanted to give my 2 cents now. So thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next